All right, friends, welcome. We'll go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sam Heath, and this is from the EJUSA Evangelical Network, our webinar series that we call In the Movement, meaning in the justice movement. And so our goal in this time is to engage and elevate different people and voices who are in different places and spaces of the justice movement. And today we're going to be talking with Eric Paul in a bit. But let me set the stage and give a little bit of background. And I'm very, very excited for this conversation, talking about restorative justice and what it is and what it means, especially for Christians to live restoratively. And what does it look like to respond to harm with some different tools than maybe what we're used to. So briefly, for EJUSA, we're a national group. We work to repeal the death penalty, and we help communities think about what does it look like to respond to harm and violence without centering punishment, police, or prisons. And my branch of that is the Evangelical Network, and I engage Christians and churches and denominations in that work and help them to meet the justice needs within their communities. So we're talking today about restorative justice, and I met Eric. It was a while back, and I thought, maybe you didn't, had an immediate rapport, was thrilled with things that you had told me, things that you sent me, I was excited to read. And the more I learned about your work, the more I realized restorative justice is something deeper and broader than what I had originally thought. So Eric, thank you, friend, for coming on here.
Yeah, it's so good to talk with you today, Sam.
Yeah, I was saying, I love your festive background. So you're really in the spirit here.
So for those that don't know, I live on the Kona side of the Big Island in Hawaii, and I live in an old farmhouse that doesn't have windows. It has windows, but it's just screens. There's no glass, and so it's made zooming from home actually somewhat difficult. So finding a spot that actually works for a Zoom where everyone can hear me was difficult. So I thought I'd just lean into the season and just show off my Christmas tree.
It works. It's great. It's great. Well, let me say a bit about Eric, who you are, and give some statistics that I think will help show some of the need of restorative justice. And then we'll get into kind of what it is. But you're with the Church of the Nazarene, and I know that you serve with the Hawaii District Church of the Nazarene to provide restorative justice practices through their churches. And you also head a secular mediation center and a church congregational conflict program. And I would love to hear about all of these. So I know a big piece of the work that you do is training and coaching pastors and congregants in what does it look like to engage conflict in a more restorative way. So we'll talk a second about restorative justice, but for a lot of people here, I feel we may know this, but I want to remind us about the American criminal legal system and the mass scale that it's at, and just briefly make a case of why we need to be doing something else. Well, one thing that really struck me when I learned it is that over half of violent crimes that occur go unreported. And so already people are choosing nothing over what our current system offers. So it seems already inherently there are a lot of ways that people know what this system provides and what it even promises. It's not really able to do that. The vast majority of survivors who go through the system are not satisfied with what the system brings them. And this is a huge system. We have 2 million people who are incarcerated. This is one out of almost every 100 people. We have the highest rate of incarceration of anyone in the world, 2,300 jails and prisons, over a third of the world's female prisoners. So this system is massive. And if it was going to work by just sheer scope and size and money, it should be the most effective one in the world. And it is effective if the goal is punishment. But that's part of what we want to question today. And that's the very thing that restorative justice gets at, is what is actually the goal? When harm happens, what should actually be the response to it? So this is really significant for us as Christians because the gospel itself is an act of restoration. God is restoring himself and bringing restoration between God, self, others, and world. And that has implications for us and how we live restoratively. So we'll talk about restorative justice as a specific niche and thing, but also about what does it mean to live restoratively as a whole. So at the end, we'll save 10 or 15 minutes for anybody who has any questions for Eric or about these things. You can hold your questions till then, or you can put them in the chat or in the Q&A as we go along. And keep in mind, we're recording it, so we'll send out a recording of this to everybody who is registered for it. But let's jump in, Eric. And one place to begin, and I think this might help tell a little bit about you. You have a daughter named Justice and a son named Micah. I know why and how are those names significant for you?
Yeah, those are obviously significant. Naming is a really important task as a parent. And one, when we read through scripture, names play a prominent role within our scriptures as Christians. They give meaning, and it gives belonging to both a family and a community. And so naming was really important for me and my partner. And so my daughter's name is Justice. She just turned 11 last week, and her middle name is Jubilee, Justice Jubilee. And we chose that middle name because we wanted to make sure that we kind of put kind of a definitional twist on her name, to make sure that we knew and others knew what it is that we meant by justice. And one of the things that you just mentioned was that 50% of crimes go unreported, which means that our criminal legal system that we have isn't actually giving out the justice that we think that it is. And I remember first walking into church with Justice was, 10 days old, something like that, very young. We had just named her, and we were sharing her name, and the response that we continually got was, so you want her to be a lawyer, or oh, well, maybe she'll grow up to be a judge one day. and we have this assumption within our mind that justice is about our court systems, that justice is really the work of our nation state and our government. And what we do is not about justice. It's about something else. It's about love. It's about care. It's about compassion. And we've somehow kind of bifurcated that justice is the work of the state, and salvation, spiritual growth is the work of, say, the church, for instance, or whatever your organization that you're a part of. And that really stuck with me, that was the assumption. And it is my firm belief that justice and peace work isn't the work of one organization over another, but it's actually community-based work. It's neighborly work, and it requires the work of us all. So that really is kind of the impetus behind the name, but also a firm belief that I have, that justice and peace is the work that all of us in the community have to work toward. It's a process.
We'll talk a little later, because I want to first get into, just for those that might need it, what restorative justice is. But when harm happens, when sin happens, it's always communal. It's never an individual thing, and therefore healing of it and response to it needs to be communal too. But we're not there yet, because you're alluding to that, and that's so key. I told someone today, she asked me, what are some of your deepest conversations in this work? And I said, when I talk about the chief narrative that we try to break is that justice is not punishment, that it's something else. That it's things like safety and healing and accountability. And I hear such an echo of that in what you're saying, that often with justice, it's synonymous with punishment, or just the criminal legal system as a whole, whereas justice is something so much broader and so much more than just that.
Yeah, and this is something that even within restorative justice communities, restorative justice as a movement that began to grow in the 1970s and 80s with community groups that were kind of diversionary programs to the criminal legal system, really built up an understanding that restorative justice belongs also within that group of crime, right? And one of the things that I find really helpful is that we're not necessarily talking about crime by itself, but all crime is harm, and all harm needs justice, right? Because what we're talking about is relationships that have experienced strain, brokenness, and fracture. And justice is about the reparation, the repair, the restoration of those relationships that have experienced harm. And that can go for individual relationships that you have with family members, right? Or classmates within a school setting, neighbors that could or could not be, say, deemed a crime, but certainly can. or even community groups against community groups or nations against nations. And this is why I've been so attractive to restorative justice as a movement, is because you can see the various social levels that it fits within, both as individuals, communal, social, political.
Mhm.
And the kind of framework that it offers to understand justice as healing, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I know Kay Pranis has talked about restorative justice being not about getting even, but getting well,
Yeah.
and that it centers the health and the healing of all parties involved. So in just a few sentences, how would you describe what restorative justice is?
Mm. Well, I've touched on it a little bit, and you just mentioned actually one of my teachers, Kay Pranis, was my Peace Circle teacher,
Mm,
mentor, and trainer. But there's another professor that I had, and teacher that I had named Dr. Joanna Turner at Eastern Mennonite University. And honestly, I couldn't put it better than her. So I'm just going to quote her out of her book, Coloring Restorative Justice. In a sentence, she talks about restorative justice as a philosophy that emphasizes healing and accountability to repair harm and wrongdoing, build community, and strengthen relationships.
mm,
And it's that dual kind of look at both healing, what it means to repair a relationship that has experienced harm and fracture, with accountability, because every wrongdoing creates obligations. It creates need for the one who has experienced harm, and it creates obligations for the one who caused that harm. And we have to come up with mechanisms and spaces and conversations that build accountability in order to make things right.
mhm, mhm. I actually know her. We've met before and gotten to speak, and she's wonderful. So that's excited that you worked with her as well. So what about you talked about accountability? It's another word that sometimes people have that's synonymous with punishment. If I'm going to hold someone accountable, but it's
Mhm.
not what you mean. So what do you mean by accountability?
What do I mean? I mean that um, there is I'll just tell a story, if it's all right, if we can tell stories, because I think
Mhm.
it actually explains it better than the theories that are in my head. Um, I was facilitating a conference couple of years last year. These It was with youth during a COVID time, in which they had gotten they were hanging out late at night, ended up trespassing on a school property. They had been drinking at the time and ended up vandalizing parts of the school. Um, all of this was caught on video. um, and so if we look at what we understand by accountability, um, well, in one term, it would be, well, this was a crime and it should be charged and it should be prosecuted, and it ends up being a type of whatever the county's filing is for however high the amount of vandalism was.
Mhm.
$3,000, $5,000, over $10,000 ends up being a different kind of misdemeanor or felony charge. And so there were four of them being having had a police report sent to the prosecutor's office, and the prosecutor's office decided perhaps this is best for a restorative justice conference. And so before even working on the charges, they called me up and they said, "Hey, would you be able to meet with these youth in order to hold them accountable?" So there were two measures here. One was accountability could have been through the criminal legal system,
Mhm.
and that would have been um, the school wouldn't have had a voice, right? The administrators at the school, the ones who had harm in that, wouldn't have had a voice. They wouldn't have received any kind of reparative kind of restitution, right? Money in order to repair the damage. It would have been in a separate system that would have excluded them from being able to share how their actions impacted them, right? But in order for these youth to be truly, I believe, held accountable, they need to have these that harm created obligations,
Mm.
right? They needed to be able to go face to face with these administrators and actually repair the harm that was done. And so we ended up meeting. We met in a circle for a couple of hours, talked through the what happens, the why it happened. There was truth telling, there was storytelling, and then there was a way in which we put in agreement, wrote down the things that needed to happen for these youth in order to make things right. And not just make things right, which is repair, but also make sure it doesn't happen again, right? And so accountability is both repair, but it's also change, right? And so being held accountable is this beautiful process, really, of allowing yourself to change. And I'm not quite sure that I know that can happen within our criminal legal system, but I think it happens less often than it does within restorative justice circles.
Sometimes I've used the acronym ARC or ARC, and I hear pieces of this in what you're saying. When I talk about what accountability is, I'll often tell people that it's acknowledgement of what's been done, the harm that's been done. It's an act of repair, like usually some physical act that has been done. And then the C is the change. Something has changed in that person's life or in the systems around it so that this act of harm can't happen again. And that's one place where a lot of people can be on the same page of when harm happens, almost everybody believes those scales of justice are imbalanced. But what brings back that balance is key of what accountability actually looks like. And it's not easy, right? I mean, you described a process that's beautiful and life-giving, but it's also difficult and painful, right? But for all parties, both the person who did the harm and the person who was harmed, to be confronted with what that person has done, to be confronted with what repair would look like, this can be something that's difficult. So there's pain that could be there. So we're not talking necessarily about pain or about total conflict avoidance. It's actually moving into it to a degree.
Yeah. And this is oftentimes we think of conflict as something to be avoided, or that we're scared to be able to honestly be vulnerable, because that kind of space that we created for these youth did take a level of vulnerability for them to be able to share why is it that you were drinking that night? What has COVID meant to you and the fracture of your social relationships, right? And so there's a level of truth telling that requires vulnerability, which requires a type of courage, bravery, right? So I work really hard to try to create a brave space. Oftentimes people want out of a facilitative dialogue to feel safe. And I can't guarantee that someone's going to feel safe within a conversation. I don't know what their past experiences have been. I don't know what triggers that they'll experience, past traumas that they bring with them into these spaces. But I can work my best to build the kinds of relationships before meeting and within that space where they feel like they can both listen and be heard.
I feel you're pressing into some of the definitions of what safety can be, which is great. I think we kind of assume it's one thing, but yet it's another. It makes me think about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when the beavers are talking about Aslan and they say, he's not safe, but he's good. Yeah. And there's an aspect of we are going to be in a place that is difficult and not safe in a lot of ways, but yet it's necessary and it's right and good. Because avoiding the pain or the conflict completely, it isn't possible. Sometimes we have to enter into that for healing to occur. So can you talk about some of the history? You mentioned this a little bit about RJ growing in the 70s. What's the history of it? I mean, there's echoes of it within the Old Testament, right? There's a lot of restitution that's there. There are indigenous communities across the world that have engaged in this in places like New Zealand. But when did it really break into things within the United States?
Yeah, that's it's a lot of fun to kind of to think about. But I want to, restorative justice as a movement as it is right now is incredibly reliant on several things. But first and foremost, there was enormous generosity of patience, of skill, of gifts that was shared with from and with indigenous communities around the world. And so we as Westerners, me as a white male, have a certain bent towards individualism, a certain bent towards seeing the world of justice between as kind of a win-lose situation, going to court, and I need to have my day in court. I need to win. This is what justice looks like. It's a competition. It's adversarial, right? Indigenous communities have a very different view. And I'll just say my mentor, my teacher, my trainer, Kay Pranis, herself was taught by Tlingit and First Nations Indigenous communities in Canada, and she talks often, and other resources that I've used, like Randy Woodley's book, The Shalom Community of Creation, have spoken often about the very communal nature of what it means to be human. And when harm happens, we're talking about a disruption of harmony. And so when we look at what justice means, it's this restoration to harmony, in which we look at not only the relationships between individuals, but with each other, with our communities, with God, and with the land, right? Creation itself. And that all of these are wrapped into harmonious relationships. So you talked about the history. This, there's some work done in the 1970s and 80s within pockets of communities in like Minnesota and Oakland and especially in Canada, in which they're working with Indigenous people within a Western mindset that just didn't work. And they realized that there were that harmony, that healing of relationships wasn't actually working for these communities, and there had to be a different way. So they began to kind of remodel, well, how is it that we can still hold people accountable to the actions while bringing about healing? And so they realized that, every community around the world has a way in which they deal with conflict. Every community has different skill sets and different philosophies, and oftentimes that's worked for them for hundreds and thousands of years. And so to lean back into those traditions, those experiences, became a way in which not only to re-engage kind of cultural identity, but also to bring about those harmonious relationships. Restorative justice as it is now kind of leans into kind of contemporary understandings of conflict resolution, and leans into the experiences with humility of learning, a posture of humility of saying, okay, we've worked this certain way and it hasn't worked very well. And so we need to be taught, and we need to listen. And so we're willing to do that if you're willing to give your gift. So that's kind of a history over the last 40 years. And again, restorative justice is kind of a contemporary movement. Is fairly new. But Kay talks about it being, Kay Pranis talks about being kind of a new old way to peacemaking, right? It's new within our own imagination. Within the last 40 years, is kind of this thing that you can learn and practice, but it's old because it really relies on these cultural practices that have been within various communities for thousands of years. I mean, sitting in a circle and holding a discussion is something that we all relate to, because it's something our ancestors have done.
Yeah, you talked about just the aspect of this that is communal, and just pitting that up against or contrasting it with the criminal legal system it's really stark, right? I mean, our criminal legal system focuses so much on the individual that did the harm, and has the state or the government be pitted against that person is not really encouraged at any point to be truthful, because the goal is to avoid punishment if they're the person who did the harm, or if the government to bring that punishment. And it doesn't allow for the person who was harmed to really come in or to be part of that. It cuts off some of those things, the very things that make restorative justice so fruitful, of being able to give space to admit or to, and this is something else I wanted to ask about. I'll hold this. In a second, we'll ask about forgiveness, because I know sometimes that's debated about what role that may or may not have, or the advantage of demanding that or not. But before we get there, though, I want to give people a sense of the spectrum of restorative justice, of how wide a breadth this is, of what it is that we're talking about. I'm going to share about the Charlottesville Restorative Justice Program here in the city in Virginia where I live, and then let's use that as a springboard to RJ can look a whole lot of ways. I mean, you yourself are engaged in church-based restorative justice work and restorative justice work outside the church. So here in Charlottesville, we have a restorative justice diversion program, and we're in its second year. I'm on the advisory council for it, and it came out of Eastern Mennonite University in their Center for Justice and Peace Building, partnering, interestingly, with the prosecutors' offices, both in Albemarle County and Charlottesville City. And those three entities paired up together to form a restorative justice program. And they've diverted 20 cases or so far. But the way that that's been structured is they pulled in a lot of support from the community. They had facilitators come in who did some training for other facilitators. And typically it's done in about a 3-session cycle. There'll be a time with it. They meet with the person who did the harm, the time that they met with the person who was harmed, and then they'll have a meeting with all of those parties together. And there might be a subsequent one after that. It's open and available to all sorts of harm or all sorts of crimes, and it's thriving. But an interesting thing and side note of it has been some of the church support with it. We've had some churches who've offered their space so that those conferences can occur in free church spaces. We've had congregants come and asked if they could be trained as facilitators. But what distinguishes this, and what I'd love to hear you talk about how this compares and contrasts with other programs, is right now, someone gets arrested for a crime that they do, and the attorneys look at it. And before this person is charged, it's looked at as, oh, is this a good case for restorative justice? And then it's diverted. They go through those conferences. If the agreements happen and all the things that are supposed to happen they report back to the judge. This happened, it was great, and everything is done from that point on. But that's not always how restorative justice can look, right?
Yeah, it looks my goal here, and in Hawaii County, we actually have a system in which it gets diverted before there are charges. So pre-court, pre-charge, and that helps for a number of reasons. One, it helps with court backlog, but it's also more effective, right? We've had over 200 cases go through a restorative conference over the last 4 years. 99% reached an agreement, and no, 100% reached an agreement. 99% didn't reoffend, right? And that's in a state in which the recidivism rate is at 54%.
Wow.
Right? And there's been over $35,000 in restitution paid out to those who have experienced harm, and every dollar of those agreements has been paid in full. And so it's effective in the way as it gets before charges even get placed. There is a little stick there, right? So for us, it's when it gets to and this was Hawaii County developed the very first restorative justice program in the nation to be housed within a prosecutor's office. Most prosecutors are interested more in prosecuting and want to get their prosecuting numbers up, and they want to show that they're dealing hard with crime. And we had a unique set of leaders within our prosecutor's office that allowed a restorative justice program within a victim assistance unit, which in most places it's a victim's assistant unit kind of walks through those who have experienced harm due to a crime as it goes up towards, say, a court date, about what to expect. They coach them. They give them resources that they need in order to connect with other social service agencies that may help in their recovery. And they coach as far as witness testimony and what to expect. And that's how it usually works, right? They kind of walk alongside victims. We have that here as well, but we also did a restorative justice project within the victim assistance unit, because restorative justice should and always remain about the needs of the person who experienced harm. And so we wrap around what those needs are, and try to meet those needs as the act of repair. And so for us, we do it before it even gets to a charge that's been placed. What I'd like to see happen is that we start building kind of a community advisory group, a network that catches this even before, say, a police report, right? So we still have the police get called in, they write a report, they send it to the prosecutor's office. What I'd like to see happen is we network with community policing and with schools and with local businesses that we can also take referrals from those before it gets to a police report. And there'd be certain levels of like what's appropriate for something like that. And obviously in instances of, say, violence, obviously there's going to be police involved in occurrences like that. Not that that doesn't mean restorative justice can't be used in those circumstances, because it absolutely can. Yeah, so that's one way. We also use it in the school systems as instead of, say, suspensions, we build up accountability and relationship building within schools. And so using restorative practices to build a culture of peace and accountability within our school systems.
A lot of restorative justice programs I know deal with the quote unquote nonviolent offenses. And there are some programs that engage more violent crimes, and it absolutely has happened. There are a few crimes that I've heard of that I haven't also heard of a restorative justice program being able to engage. It's just not as prevalent. I've also heard you distinguish between the words crime versus harm before, Eric, another time that we talked. Can you talk more about the importance of that language and how those are not always synonymous?
Yeah, I think I mentioned kind of a variation of this earlier, but if there's a crime, there's harm. Like all crime is harm, but not all harm to relationships end up being criminal. Or also, not all harm makes it to being prosecuted as a crime, right? And then again, that goes to how you introduced that only 50% of crimes go reported. And I'll say that this happens in all of our communities, in which there is harm that's done within our churches. There's harm that's done within our schools. There's harm that's done within our workplaces that that needs a process in place in order to bring about healing. And this is, again, wrestling away that understanding of justice away from just something that happens within our court system. But there can be justice processes to repair harm and wrongdoing that happen within our churches, our schools, and our workplaces, even our family systems, right? And so being able to understand that we're talking about healing harm and wrongdoing that's been done, and holding accountable those who have caused it is what we're talking about, not necessarily just something that happens within a court system in a criminal legal field.
With restorative justice, the goal is healing, but what role, if any, does forgiveness have? I mentioned that a little bit earlier. I mean, forgiveness isn't something that you can really force or demand. And I mean, forgiveness is not only a Christian word, but it's an especially Christian word in a lot of ways. And does that have a place in restorative justice, or is that only when you're in your explicit, I'm a Christian doing this work space, and not within a secular space? Just what role does forgiveness have or not?
I think it is an absolutely beautiful thing when we reach a point of forgiveness. We are, as Christians, called to forgive as God has forgiven us. I believe that forgiveness releases us, right? I think
Mhm.
I think being at a point where we are unable to forgive is a type of burden that we carry. Um, Forgiveness is also a process. It takes time, it takes patience, and not everyone gets there, and that's okay. Um, it shouldn't be, I don't believe that forgiveness should be required in doing restorative justice work. Um, I I believe that we can still repair harm and build accountability and build relationships. Forgiveness is about it isn't necessarily what happens between the acts that happen, the behaviors that happen between two people. Forgiveness is interior. We choose to forgive when we've reached that point when we're ready to let go, and um, that takes a lot of learning.
Mhm.
That takes a lot of grace,
Mhm.
um, and I wouldn't put that on anyone and say, okay, now we've reached that step in a process in which you now have to forgive. It doesn't, I don't think forgiveness quite works that way. I
Mhm.
think we can put steps and processes in place in which we can create a space of encounter, create a space in which there's reparative acts, create a space in which there's truth telling, in which there's acknowledgement, in which there's actual um, ways to make sure it doesn't happen again. And oftentimes, this is exactly what those who have experienced harm need in order to move forward in a healthy way.
Mhm.
But for that person, whether they're Christian or not Christian, right? Forgiveness is a universal human thing. um, it often it often means that they have to be ready for it.
Mhm.
And we can build that kind of space, but it's not something that we say, okay, now's the time.
Mhm. Mhm. I want to ask about Matthew 18 for a bit, and then about some practical ways Christians and churches can engage in all of this. So lots of people looked at Matthew 18 as the church discipline verse of when something happens within the church, here's what we do. But this gives us a model for just how to engage conflict as a whole. And one thing I remember you
Mm-hmm.
talking to me about with this passage is Matthew 18 is written within the context of conflicts already.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about, you said this earlier, but I'd love to hear you say more about conflict being a natural part of creation itself. I think often people think conflict is always wrong, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not necessarily the case.
No, and we have this we have this idea in the church that if there's conflict, there's sin, um, and therefore we need to deal with conflict like it's sin. Someone's going to have to repent, and if I have to call someone out on their sin, then it I'm doing the righteous thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, Conflict is embedded in human relationships. There's conflict because we are in relationships with one another, and God created us in communities, um, interdependent and diverse, which means there's going to be differences in opinions, there's going to be differences in culture, there's going to be differences in experiences, there's going to be all these types of differences in which we have an opinion or a goal that gets frustrated. And that's what conflict is. It's when I have a goal, I have a vision, I have an opinion, and it gets frustrated by someone else's goal, vision, or opinion. Um, and that doesn't mean that there's sin. It just means that we're thinking differently, we're behaving differently. It's when sin enters the picture is how we manage it, how we deal with it, how we engage it. Um, and I believe that conflict is actually an opportunity for change. I believe and I belong to the Nazarene Church. We believe highly in what's called means of grace. There are certain practices that we can do that bestow grace on us in order to become more like Jesus. And engaging in healthy processes for conversation, um, it and implementing change processes that end up strengthening relationships is a means of grace. It is a way in which we can transform more into the likeness of Jesus, if we enter it with that kind of posture. At the same time, as engaging conflict can lead to positive outcomes, if we engage it in an unhealthy way, right? If we triangulate others into the conflict, if we call our best friend over and said, you won't believe what this person just did to me. You won't believe that this person thinks this way. I can't believe that I just found out that this person was such and such supporter within our political realm, right? Then we start to bring people onto our side. And when we start bringing people onto our side, then we start, instead of seeing, say, the sameness that we share as humans, we start to identify more with the differences. And there becomes this kind of divide. And that leads from differences to separation, right? Both mentally and physically, which can lead to superiority. Not only are we different, but I think I'm better. And when we start to think in kind of a superiority, then it becomes easier then to dehumanize. And so it's this kind of like spiral down into all of a sudden we're not talking about the other as a person. We're talking about the other as something distinctly different than us, which makes it easier to separate ourselves. It makes it easier to do violence against them, right? And in Matthew 18, the whole thing takes place within issues of money and power, right? It starts with a parable about money, and it ends with the disciples saying, "Okay, who's the greatest?" And so Jesus starts talking about conflict and working through, like, how is it that you are to deal with this? It's very practical in nature. That was very long-winded. I apologize. I'm not sure.
No, it's so important that there's a lot of pieces to connect. Well, and Matthew 18 ends with, well, if this conflict is unresolved, then you treat this person as a tax collector. But again, that's something that I think a lot of people assume something about, but that's not necessarily the case. I think a lot of people hear that and it's like, oh, okay, they're excommunicated, they're out forever, and I completely dissociate from them. That's not what it's getting at.
No, because I think our lens for understanding and interpreting scripture is always the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when we look at the life of Jesus didn't exclude tax collectors from his circle of care. Jesus didn't exclude tax collectors from having a meal with him, right? It was, I take that often to mean something along the lines of treat them like a tax collector, meaning still engage with them. Don't end the conversation. Don't walk away. Don't cut things off. Don't exclude. Eat with them, right? There's still this desire towards communion. There's still this desire towards relationship.
So, Eric, what are some ways, one, that people can think about just living restoratively overall? And then let's get specific to thinking about restorative justice as something Christians and churches can engage. But you've talked about schools, you've talked about families, but what are some general ways people can think about, well, I want to live restoratively in all of my spheres? So here are some tools or ways to think.
Yeah. The first one that comes to my mind is presence, right? I often think about the work of peace and justice in an understanding of shalom, right? This kind of biblical understanding of harmonious relationships. And shalom is this kind of umbrella category. It connotes wholeness, it connotes harmony, welfare, safety, fullness, rest, right? Completeness, all of prosperity, health. What we're after in kind of a shalom vision for our churches, but also for the world, is this harmony with God, with others, with ourself, and with creation. And so the first thing is, like, shalom is holistic. It's this kind of holistic category. It resists all of our dualistic tendencies to separate justice from something that the church does or doesn't do, right? But it's also, it's tested on the margins. Shalom is tested on the margins. So it's revealed, and we read this throughout Isaiah. You know, my son's name is Micah, throughout the prophet Micah, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even in the Gospels, in the way that Jesus moves throughout Judea and Samaria, right? It's shalom is revealed in how a society treats its poor, its oppressed, its disempowered, its needy, and part of leaning into that shalom vision of the kingdom of God is to come near to those communities, to be present, and honestly, for those who are more privileged, to listen and learn. And so for me, that's humility, right? The practice of the virtue of humility is listening. And so we come close in nearness and proximity, but we do so with our ears open. So that's how I think I would first answer your question.
You've used the word a few times of having a posture towards something, and so much of restorative justice, it requires a posture of humility. It requires a posture towards harm, of being open to asking questions of what is it that we can do and how can we pursue healing, rather than mandating or stating that this is the way that it's going to be. What then can churches do? If churches hear some of this and start reimagining Matthew 18 and seeing how this applies in a way that I may not have thought before, how can churches start to take some tools from this and implement those in their own communities?
Yeah. Well, one, it's not that hard to look at your church and assess it's whether or not you are engaged with, near to, proximate with marginalized communities. And opening up relationships within different spaces, right? I know that this is a need for the Nazarene church within the United States. We are 92% white, which is staggering. And so we have a lot of work to do with listening and engaging communities that have a lot to teach us, both from a kind of experience level of perspectives and understanding justice issues, but also theologically. God created us to be diverse and have different opinions and understandings, and we bring those with us when we interpret scripture, and we can learn a lot from our Black and brown communities in the United States. The second thing is that this is engaging conflict in a healthy way is difficult because it doesn't necessarily come natural. We have learned habits, right? We have learned conflict modes, conflict styles, where it's easy for me to either say, and talking about postures, right? A posture of our fists up. I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to fight you. I'm going to win this. I come into this relationship because I need to prove that I'm right. Or we avoid it. We don't want to feel all the feels that dealing with conflict makes us feel. Right. And so we avoid it. Sometimes we're so quick just to accommodate. We accommodate over and over and over that at some point it's just going to pop the lid off the teapot, right? Where we feel so disempowered because we've accommodated so much that then we erupt. And so one, understanding, your kind of your own conflict style, but also your congregations or culture's conflict style, and knowing how to kind of move between them in order to get your needs met. Conflict is about having your needs met, right? Your needs of belonging, your material needs of safety, security, shelter, food, your needs of kind of those survival needs, right? And then the second is that this is a skill that can be learned. Third, I think I'm on the third. This is a skill that can be learned. I remember when I first thought that I had such a great head knowledge of how to do this work. And I sat down and I was dealing with a couple in our congregation that was in a conflict. And I thought, I have the theoretical knowledge to be able to do this. Let's have a conversation. And it went so poorly. It caused more harm to the relationship. And I realized that I needed to build a skill set, a toolbox of how to build the kind of spaces. And that's what we're doing. Reconciliation happens within a space, a physical space, a face-to-face encounter that can have a conversation. And I didn't know how to do that. And so I've spent the last really 8 years of my life building that toolkit. Now, most people won't need to spend 8 years doing that. It just became a passion of mine and my particular vocational call to be able to give this to the church. For most congregations, look up your local mediation center. They have trainings all the time, or go to the International Institute for Restorative Practices, which IIRP.org or .com or one of those dots, and they have trainings as well in restorative practices, restorative justice, and peace circles. And so reach out for those trainings that are going to be, say, 3, 4, 5 days rather than 8 years. Yeah, lean into building that kind of skill set.
I have one more thing I want to ask you, but I also wanted to make sure and see if anybody else had any questions. So for all of you watching and listening, feel free to put those into the chat or into the Q&A feature. And I see yours asking about if EJUSA does work in Georgia, and we do. And I'd love to talk to you about that. And I see the link that you put there, so I'll email everyone after this a recording and any of the resources that we've mentioned, and you can respond right to that and we can talk some more. But if there are any other questions, put those in as we start to move toward wrapping up. Eric, you touched on this, but what would be some next steps of resources or books that people could look to? You talked about IRP, and I'll send that link out in the email too, but where are some other places or spaces that people could look at that may or may not be explicitly Christian?
Yeah, well, I'll start with explicitly Christian.
Okay.
If you're interested in, say, a book that's really, really helpful for congregations, and you want to take 6 weeks with a small group, or something like that, John Paul Lederach's book, Reconcile, Conflict Transformation for Ordinary Christians, is fabulous.
I think I read it. I think I read it because you told me 2 months ago.
Okay. That one's really, really great. The Duke Center for Reconciliation has a kind of a group of books as well. One of those is called Reconciling All Things. It's by Emmanuel Katongole and Chris Rice. A Christian Vision for Justice, Peace, and Healing. It looks like this: Reconciling All Things. It's also a really good both of these are really accessible for those who don't have theological training. The other series of books is put out by Eastern Mennonites Center for Justice and Peace Building, which is where I did some of my graduate work from. And they have a whole series of little books for justice and peace building. One of which, if you're interested in circle processes, is a little book of circle process. But there's another one, if you're interested in, say, the intersection of restorative justice and race, there's one by Fania Davis called The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice. Yeah, there it is.
I had a colleague just give me this one as well. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah. And EMU also has a back catalog of all of their webinars that they've done through the Center for Justice and Peace Building. And those are at the intersections of conflict transformation, justice movements, restorative justice, justice work in schools and the criminal legal system, the intersection of indigenous communities and restorative justice, as well as race and racism within the United States. So it's a really great resource.
Okay.
Living Justice Press, which is a website, is devoted to restorative justice resources. I would really encourage people to check that website out as well, Living Justice Press.
Okay, great. Okay, I've made note of these, and I'll send them out to everybody in the email. Also saw one question about if someone's not able to do a master's in this, then what what are some courses or places that they could look at
Mm.
that would be able to offer some training?
Yeah. So I keep going back to there's a summer peace institute. One of the things that COVID did is it decentralized education forums, and a lot of classes now through, say, universities, you can take not for credit, and you can take them from the comfort of your home via Zoom. And so I know for a fact that Eastern Mennonite University does a summer peace building institute week-long classes that you can take either for credit towards, say, a graduate certificate or a master's, or just as professional development. And they do those with I just finished one on actually trauma healing. So trauma resistance and awareness training. And so that's one resource. There are the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame. There's IARP is not a space that does, say, academic credits, but professional development. And depending on what your denomination is, right? If you're Nazarene, come talk to me. I can do trainings. I can lead cohorts and groups through this. If you are Mennonite, there's a peace education coordinator within the Mennonite Central Committee for the United States. If you are Methodist, there's the Just Peace UMC, which does trainings for Methodists. A lot of denominations have started to realize that we haven't done enough work around conflict, peace, and justice. And so there are people within those denominations who you can reach out to, and they can help you as far as your specific church is concerned.
Okay.
So I'd encourage that as well. Find out what your church is already doing, and lean into that.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is there's not a shortage of resources. There's not a shortage of places and spaces and people that enable this. A lot of this is just awakening ourselves to the idea that when harm happens, we don't have to meet it with further harm, that we can meet it with healing. And again, as Christians, we especially have the tools to be able to do that. And we have the sustaining spirit within us to be able to do that. Okay. Well, Eric, I'll email everybody everything that you said in the next day or so, and a recording of this. I just put in the chat our link tree. If you're here, you're probably already on our email list for the Evangelical Network, but if not, we'd love for you all to sign up for that. We also have a church and justice tool where we talk about some of these things, about trauma, about harm, about violence, about the death penalty, but we do it in a specific way that's geared towards churches. And before I briefly pray for you, Eric, thank you for coming. I love talking with you because of the way that you say these things, because of the way I know how Jesus has changed your life and brought you to a place of doing this. So you are an incredible encouragement to me. So I am really grateful that you came here today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah,
It's been a lot of fun.
Oh, so glad. So glad. Let me pray for you, and then we'll head out. Father, thank you that we've had this time. I pray that you would guide all of us to lean into the fact that the work of your Son was one of restoration, and that we would meet harm with healing rather than further harm. I pray a blessing upon Eric and his ministry and the work that he does, that you would multiply and provide for him all that he needs to be able to show the world the grace and the restoration that we know through your Son. We pray these things in his name. Amen. All right, Eric, thank you again very much. And thank you to everyone else for coming in and joining today. And I'll reach out to you all through email soon. Bye-bye.